Grace Raynor wrote the column today on the SEC quarterback carousel, as The Athletic's done a series of these. And Grace, the SEC, one of the more interesting leagues, and thanks for hopping on the show with us, when it comes to quarterbacks, because the teams that are classically not the ones worrying about it are now, especially in Alabama's case, very worried about who's going to be their quarterback next year.
Yeah, it was a really interesting and sort of fascinating exercise to do, just kind of going through and looking at it. And you're right. I mean, you look up, and I think we can all agree that when we look at the SEC, you feel pretty solid every year about Georgia and Alabama, and yet these are the two programs that are going to have pretty major changes at quarterback. So I thought that was interesting. Obviously, we saw Alabama go into the portal, get a little bit of help there. But yeah, I'm excited to see just kind of what shakes out, and obviously it's a league with a lot of talent as usual.
Grace, what did you think about Alabama deciding to go and get Tyler Buchner? I mean, clearly that indicated that there was some level of feeling like there's a hole still there remaining, but do you feel like that solves their puzzle, or do you think it's still as confusing perhaps as it was before?
Yeah, I mean, I am no Alabama expert. Let me just throw that out there. But I read it very similarly to the way you did, is that, okay, we went through the whole spring. We saw Jalen Milroe and Ty Simpson. I thought they were going to be sort of battling out to compete for that starting job. And then they go in and get Buchner. And obviously he is reuniting with former offensive coordinator Tommy Rees. I get all that. But I don't know. I mean, he doesn't really – he didn't seem like a slam dunk to me in the portal just because of we didn't see a lot of him last year. I mean, he missed 10 to 13 games due to injury, and obviously he opened the season as a starter. But I think there's still a lot of meat on the bone there in terms of what are we going to see. And so I thought that was the most fascinating part, is that Alabama's quarterback competition was obviously not settled, and Saban clearly felt like they needed some more competition in the room.
Are you surprised that Florida was not more aggressive in what they try to do at quarterback?
When I look at Florida, I think obviously we all at one point thought they were going to have Jaden Rashada before that fell through. And so I think that with Florida, I feel pretty strongly that they've got their quarterback of the future already committed in DJ Lagway. And so I sort of look at 2023 as just sort of bridging the gap. Graham Mertz, I know a lot of fans were not ecstatic about when they got him from the portal, but I sort of just look at this year as maybe just a reloading year for them before they can usher Lagway in and then go from there.
What do you make of the way Lane Kiffin has approached this offseason at quarterback? Obviously, you had Jackson Dart there, but he didn't feel that was adequate enough. But to go and double dip with Walker Howard and Spencer Sanders, what is that? What is your reaction to that from an Ole Miss perspective?
I mean, the first thing I thought when I saw that was, obviously Lane has kind of named himself the Portal King, and I thought he very much lived up to his nickname this off season. And I think I had read at some point some local Ole Miss reporters saying that he felt like he needed to still see a decent amount from his contenders, and then obviously he dips into the portal. I think it's a really interesting competition, because you would think Jackson Dart's going to have to earn it back, but Sanders' resume is pretty impressive, and I don't know that he would enter the portal after starting for 4 years at Oklahoma State with the numbers that he put up, thinking I'm going to be okay being a backup or sitting on the bench. And so then you look at Howard, he doesn't have a ton of experience, but he's a former top 50 recruit. And so I think it's a really interesting dynamic there, but I'm most interested to see what happens with Sanders, just given that this is obviously a really proven guy who, if we're reading the tea leaves here, you don't think he enters the portal if he doesn't think he's going to play.
Who do you think is the most confident position entering this year at quarterback?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I would go LSU. I think they've got probably, in my opinion, one of the best quarterback duos, 1 and 2 in the SEC, in Jaden Daniels and Garrett Nussmeier. Especially with Nussmeier not entering the transfer portal. I thought that was huge for them to be able to retain him, and I think Daniels will sort of take that next step. In 2023, obviously, we saw them have a lot of success in year one, his first year in the system. So sometimes obviously we see quarterbacks that second year sort of take a step back and go into a little bit of a slump, but I think he's experienced enough and has a year in this system and has had enough time to take that next step. So I think I like LSU in that regard.
You said it, I think, correctly when it came to South Carolina, like the first line of it. Who would have guessed Spencer Rattler would still be in college in 2023? It would have been very interesting when he was on Netflix all those years ago, as this high-profile prospect to think he'd still be around, and having moved schools as well. I know you covered South Carolina. So what's the feel about, what he's got going on there in Columbia and, him being back, what that means for the Gamecocks?
Yeah, I mean, right, like if we all would have made a lot of money if we had bet however many years ago that Spencer Rattler would still be on a college roster in 2023. But I think this South Carolina team has a lot of momentum, and he's obviously a huge part of that. But you look up in any team like South Carolina who can beat Clemson and Tennessee and knock both of them out of the playoffs to end their season. That's a really good way to go into 2023. So I think they're excited about his experience. They feel good about him coming back for another year. And then they've got Luke Doty, their backup there, and I've heard good things about this true freshman, Lenora Sellers, who I think flipped from Syracuse, if I'm not mistaken, sort of at the last minute, right before signing day. But yeah, I mean, if you're Shane Beamer and you're trying to build and you're trying to take that next step and use an experienced quarterback to build around, to then pitch to recruits in the future, I think you feel pretty good about that.
What is just to deviate from quarterbacks here, this is the first time that there's buzz around the Gamecocks in quite a long time of an upward trajectory.
For sure. I mean, for as long as I've lived in South Carolina for 6 years, and I covered Clemson primarily, but for as long as I had lived in the state, I mean, it was very obvious that Clemson sort of owned this rivalry, and that's kind of how things went. And they were playing in the playoff, and South Carolina was sort of going through, different coaches and trying to figure out who they were going to be and get back to being competitive again, like we know they can be, and like we saw under Spurrier. But yeah, I mean, definitely in the last, I would say, maybe 10 years or so, you guys can disagree with me or correct me if I'm wrong, it just feels like there's more buzz heading into this program this year than there has been in a really long time.
Does it really matter who Georgia's starting quarterback is?
I think no. I know we wrote that. What do you guys think? I mean, I just think they're so loaded. Like, I'm not saying you and I could do it, but I don't think that it matters at this point in terms of the guys on their roster. I
mean, I think every quarterback matters to an extent, but to less of an extent for them than probably anybody else.
Yeah, look, yeah. I mean, if everybody around you is the Incredible Hulk, it doesn't matter if Hawkeye's the quarterback. I think it's going to be fine.
Yes. Exactly. I mean, when you have as many 5 stars as Georgia has, and I think I was talking to our Georgia writer a couple of days ago about this, it seems like Carson Beck is going to be the pick coming out of spring. But also, like the fact that Vandegrift is just casually a former 5-star and Stockton is another 4-star, just possibly waiting in the wings as the backups. I mean, I just don't really think it matters at that point.
Grace, I just couldn't help but, in reading your article earlier, and I did the same thing when looking at some of the other conference previews because you guys have, had the ACC, Big 12, et cetera, but just the impact of the transfer portal, right? I mean, nearly every single one of these teams has, at the quarterback position alone, some sort of transfer impact for now or in the future. Just as somebody who's, covered the game now for a while, can you even – how has it changed your, approach or just the way that you look at things, the impact? Can you even quantify it, the transfer portal in college football?
I think what the transfer portal is doing and the biggest impact that it's having is, even though in a lot of cases it can be sort of a 1-year solution or a quick fix, it's making teams instant contenders. I mean, I think Kentucky's a really good example. We look at Will Levis leave, and I think going into this offseason, we would have asked questions about where does Kentucky go from here, and then they go get Devin Leary from NC State out of the portal, and immediately they've got a 6-year senior who is going to be in really good position to take them to make them competitive and keep them competitive. So I think it's interesting, and we'll see as we learn more about the portal and more about the way teams are using it in terms of how it impacts their high school recruiting. But NC State's another example. They go get Brennan Armstrong from Virginia. I know he had a bad year this past year, but he was really, really great a couple of years ago. And so I think it's just making teams instantly competitive that need some juice, and in some cases are maybe trying to take that next step.
Grace Raynor of The Athletic. Grace, thank you so much for hopping on the show. Great stuff.
Oh, yeah. Thank y'all so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Grace Raynor of The Athletic. Read her stuff there. Look,